Our last speaker for this session is Dr. Matthew Rimmer. Dr. Rimmer is a professor of intellectual property and innovation law at the Faculty of Business and Law, QUT. He is a world-renowned authority on intellectual property laws. I will not spend any more time in introducing him because we all know him. And 3D printing is one of his research areas. Today, in his today's talk, he will be discussing the right to repair from the perspective of sustainable development. I hand over to Professor Rimmer.
Thank you very much. One of the kind of recurring themes during the project that we've been undertaking on intellectual property and 3D printing has been the question of the right to repair. And in our fieldwork, when we have kind of interviewed makers and managers of Makerspaces and users of 3D printers, the question of repair has kind of come up repeatedly. In terms of legal debate, there's been quite a lot of litigation across different disciplines over the right to repair, but also in terms of our public policy contribution, the right to repair has become a really important and critical issue. So Treasury undertook an investigation on repair information in relation to automobiles. I put in a submission to that particular inquiry. There's been a larger inquiry that has been finally set up and established for the Productivity Commission to investigate the right to repair, and we're participating in that inquiry in various different ways. So my presentation today in some ways presents a sliver of that engagement on the topic of the right to repair. And today I really want to kind of focus on the political role of Shane Rattenbury in pushing for the Productivity Commission to have an inquiry into the right to repair, and also focus on the various different legal questions that arise in relation to the right to repair. And as I said, the right to repair as a topic has shifted and changed over the years with the appearance of new technologies. So when I was a law student back in the 1990s, the discussion about spare parts and the right to repair in a pre-internet age was very much focused upon customising cars and repairing cars and other machines of one kind or another. I think one of the big kind of pressure points in relation to the right to repair has been the emergence of a whole set of new technologies. So IT, electronics, some of the medical technologies that we heard about in the previous speaker. 3D printing and additive manufacturing has become much more mainstream. That has created a wider range of contexts in which the right to repair has become a very critical issue. From a historical perspective, in some ways, I think the discussion over the right to repair is a really classical one. So in colonial Australia, there was a huge difficulty in terms of relying upon colonial imperial Britain for a whole wide range of machines and for spare parts. And as a result, there was a great need for local repairs, but also local innovation and local invention. The Furphys in Shepparton, my family is from Shepparton, are the Fords. The Fords and the Furphys got along quite well with one another. The Furphys were great storytellers, but they were also incredible inventors. They filed early colonial Victorian patents on threshing devices and water carts and a whole wide range of other technology. But it was kind of part of a culture of thrift and frugal innovation. And it's been kind of interesting thinking about the way in which the debate over the right to repair in Australia has evolved. In some ways, there's been a kind of resurgence of interest in a kind of a do-it-yourself local making culture. As I said before, the right to repair debate has been a very long-standing one in Australia and has often been quite a frustrating one. In some ways, the discussions have been very fragmented. There have been various different affected constituencies like consumers and farmers and scientists and researchers and those who hot rod or make and customise hot rod cars who've been concerned about the right to repair, but there's been a lack of a key figure to bring all those issues together until recently. As part of the empirical research, I kind of interviewed Shane Rattenbury, who previously was the Minister for Justice in the ACT government and the Minister for Consumer Affairs. More recently, he has become Attorney-General for the ACT government. Shane Rattenbury has, for a long while, been part of a collaboration between the Greens, who is the leader of in the ACT, and the Australian Labor Party in the ACT, led by Andrew Barr, who have a coalition government. And as a result, Shane Rattenbury has had to kind of shift to a role of negotiating various different policy outcomes and policy strategies as part of that coalition government. In some ways, that has been very productive for a wide range of issues around sustainability and climate action and environmental protection. But it has also kind of given him a platform in which to raise issues of national concern with other ministers from other states and territories and the federal government. So in speaking with Shane Rattenbury, he said that it was a very interesting position to be in. He originally started his career as a civil society activist for Greenpeace, and now he feels that he's kind of shifted into a position of governance, but he feels that he can still draw upon all those previous skills in his new role. And he has been a very articulate and eloquent advocate for the need for a right to repair in Australia. And I think he has been particularly good at integrating and synthesising a number of different concerns around this space. So in submissions that he's kind of made to his fellow ministers concerned about consumer affairs, he's emphasised a range of important economic themes. So he's kind of highlighted questions around Australian consumer law and some of the action that has been taken against Apple and others over questions of repair by the ACCC. He has kind of pushed for greater scrutiny of some of the competition impacts of monopolisation of aftermarkets. While not necessarily being a specialist in intellectual property, he's certainly been concerned about the impact of intellectual property rights on repair. Particularly, there was some litigation in Norway against an independent repairer by Apple under trademark law, which he was kind of concerned about. But in terms of economic themes, he was also kind of concerned about what it meant for Australia in terms of international trade, if it was dependent upon other markets for its goods, to what extent was repair important, what were the flexibilities and limitations in terms of international trade regimes like the TRIPS agreement and the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He also had a very kind of keen interest in some of the environmental outcomes associated with the right to repair. So he was deeply concerned about the proliferation of electronic waste, and he thought that there was a need to stop technology developers having a culture of technological obsolescence in which goods wore out very quickly and you were encouraged, instead of repairing those goods, to go off and buy new goods. He wanted to boost efforts to have stronger laws around product stewardship in Australia, but he was also very keen on Australia implementing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which not only has a kind of particular goal focused upon responsible consumption and production, but it has a number of other goals that have complementary concerns around innovation, clean energy, food security, and a range of other goals. From a larger perspective, as a kind of a past environmental and climate campaigner, he kind of thought that the question of the right to repair was significant in terms of larger action in relation to climate change and trying to shift to a low emissions economy and to reduce some of the wasteful behaviour within society. Shane Rattenbury was also very kind of conscious of comparative developments. So in the European Union, there's been a very strong push for recognition of eco-design and strong implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And as part of the Green Deal in the European Union, there's a very strong focus upon having a circular economy and trying to implement a right to repair. The United Kingdom has also had various different discussions about the importance of the right to repair. In the United States, there is a very complicated battle going on at the moment between technology companies which are resisting the introduction of the right to repair. So John Deere, for instance, the tractor manufacturer, Elon Musk and Tesla is opposing the right to repair. He doesn't want people to fiddle underneath with what's in his Tesla cars. Apple and some other technology developers as well have been resistant to the right to repair, but there's been a range of civil society groups who have been pushing for state-based recognition of a right to repair, sometimes in relation to certain technology sectors like automobiles, but in other occasions a more general right. And that's become a much more critical issue with the COVID crisis, in which there's been a lot of concern about repairing broken down essential machinery and equipment like medical infrastructure. So Ron Wyden, an Oregon politician, has been pushing for a right to repair in respect of medical infrastructure. Across my career, I've been kind of very interested in the role of innovation centres and makerspaces of one kind or another. I did a lot of work at one stage in relation to climate change and intellectual property, and I was very kind of interested in the establishment of a technology mechanism under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So now there is a centre that has been established in Denmark with a network of climate innovation centres around that hub, and they're meant to work together to try to encourage research, development and deployment of new clean technologies. Unfortunately, the mechanism has not worked as well as we had hoped. It's kind of been underfunded, unfortunately, and they've often provided technical information without actually engaging in technology transfer. But nonetheless, in the context of sustainable development, there's been a lot of interest in terms of could makers and makerspaces and fab labs and tech shops and hacker spaces kind of play a role in promoting some of those goals. It's been very noticeable during empirical research that we've done that some of the makerspaces, both those in the United States and more broadly, have been very interested in developing a Bill of Rights, also involving the right to repair. There's also been a kind of a critical movement which has suggested that there's a need to go further than some of the initial technocratic standards set up by Make magazine and the Make Affairs. So this is a critical making vision that tries to go beyond a mere technical right to repair to a much more inclusive vision of the maker movement. The Fab Lab movement, although initially kind of promoted by MIT, has really kind of taken off, in particular in the European Union. And it's very noticeable that there were networks of Fab Labs working together on various different projects, sometimes particularly focused upon sustainable development. Sometimes there were open design projects, there were fashion projects, there were food projects, there were ventures looking at cities. So that kind of particular Fab Lab movement has kind of been a really important and significant model. Hasn't necessarily got a very strong or prominent place in Australia, but it has sometimes also been promoted as a model to promote sustainable development. There's some specialist organisations like iFixit that have become particularly dedicated to pushing for a right to repair in terms of an advocacy role, but have also tried to create a culture around repair. So iFixit do tear downs and break down pieces of technology to show all their kind of various component parts. They've been increasingly involved in litigation as they have shared manuals on how to fix various different appliances and electronics, and they, in some occasions, have been sued by the copyright holders of those manuals. In Australia, we've seen the growth of repair centres. So Guru Anverbest came last year to a right to repair function that was held in South Bank. Substation 33 with Tony Sharp as a social enterprise that has been very active in having repair as a way of recycling and reusing a whole wide range of different technologies, but it is also meant to be an inclusive space to bring in various different parts of the community to be engaged in some of those activities. They came along to the Waste Maker Fair at QUT. And increasingly, we've kind of seen the development of circular economy innovation networks. And there's been an effort to develop centres that have been focused upon sustainable development and the circular economy. So CSIRO just released a big new study talking about some of the potential and opportunities associated with the development of a circular economy. At an international level, Achim Steiner, who was previously the head of the United Nations Environment Programme, has been a keen advocate of setting up an Accelerator Lab network under the United Nations Development Programme. So he was rather frustrated at the Rio +20 summit, in which he was pushing for a technology mechanism to be set up as part of those discussions. And really that was knocked back by the United States contingent led by Hillary Clinton. But in his new role, he has established very quickly a very significant web of accelerator labs that are designed to help realise the different sustainable development goals. He's obtained funding from Germany and Qatar and from some other sources as well. It'll be interesting to see and evaluate that network to see whether it realises some of those goals. So I guess my argument from that section is that, well, we should think about sustainable makerspaces and set up circular economy labs and establish centres that can help enable collaboration to achieve some of the sustainable development goals. Just to wrap up, I just want to mention the Productivity Commission and its inquiry into the right to repair and larger considerations about intellectual property and sustainable development. So Shane Rattenbury worked away at the Treasurer and his junior ministers to get them to give a reference to the Productivity Commission to establish an inquiry into the right to repair. And in the end, I think that push was successful because there were parts of the coalition who were deeply concerned about those issues. So the National Party in particular were very concerned about issues around the right to repair in tractors and farm machinery. There were segments of the coalition who were also kind of concerned about some of the questions around fair competition. Equally, some of the Australian Labor Party premiers seemed to kind of take an interest in the topic. So he was able to build a sufficient coalition to get an agreement for there to be an inquiry into the topic of the right to repair. The Productivity Commission normally goes through a number of different stages. When it does an inquiry, it has an issues paper, it has a discussion paper, and then it will have a final paper with recommendations. They like to do consultations with key stakeholders. They encourage submissions from a wide range of different parties. They have previously had a very strong interest in intellectual property and have conducted inquiries into intellectual property and trade, into intellectual property arrangements. In some ways, they're very well suited to conducting an inquiry into the right to repair. Thus far, the commissioners, Julie Abramson, and Paul Lindwall have used Zoom a lot to try to engage in some of the consultations with stakeholders, because the Productivity Commission has kind of been based in Melbourne, Victoria. So at this stage, they don't necessarily have any firm recommendations. They're interested in empirical evidence about whether or not there are any barriers to engaging in repair in Australia, and whether they are legal barriers or market barriers or technical barriers. But also they're thinking about the adequacy of some of the existing laws that impact upon repair. As an intellectual property lawyer, I am struck about how messy our laws are when they deal with the topic of repair. And the different species of intellectual property deal with the topic of repair quite differently. And due to a lack of reform, I think in some circumstances recently, courts have been taking upon themselves to try to reinterpret how we think about repair. So in copyright law, there's been a concern about how copyright law impacts upon manuals, but also technological protection measures can affect circumventing some sort of copy protection that might be associated with some sort of IT product. Designs law does have a spare parts defence. It's a very convoluted and complicated defence. In a dispute over car parts, the Federal Court interpreted it in quite a broad way. Trademark law potentially could impact the right to repair given what happened in the Norwegian dispute. In patent law, the High Court of Australia have recently reconsidered how they deal with the question of exhaustion of patent rights, and that may be productive in terms of how we deal with repairs. But there isn't any dedicated specific defence or exception in relation to the right to repair, as there is in relation to designs law. Increasingly, there will be tensions between trade secrets law and the right to repair, to the extent that information about how a piece of technology works is kept confidential. That might make access to that information particularly difficult. And in relation to data and information, there have been some very specialist regimes set up to try to deal with the topic of repair. Some of those regimes seem to be very complicated, particularly in relation to automobiles. In addition to intellectual property, there are a number of other legal disciplines that will connect to the topic of the right to repair. Consumer law, competition policy, product liability, innovation law and policy, environmental law, eco-design law, sustainable development, and international law. And I would argue, in terms of intellectual property, we need some sort of holistic common approach to dealing with the topic of the right to repair, rather than such a fragmented approach. But moreover, we can't think about intellectual property as being isolated from these other legal forms of discipline and regulation. So we do need intellectual property to be properly informed by consumer law and competition policy. We do need to green intellectual property and make sure that it takes into account considerations of environmental law and eco-design law and sustainable development. So I'd certainly encourage you all to participate in that inquiry, which will be going on over the next year. At a larger end, I think there's a kind of a larger discussion to be had about the relationship between intellectual property and the Sustainable Development Goals. As Joseph Stiglitz and others have argued, we need to reform our intellectual property institutions, treaties, laws, policies and practices to better account for those various different forms of Sustainable Development Goals. So in conclusion, my hope is that we develop a right to repair in Australia that cuts across a wide range of different technologies and contexts. I think it's particularly important given the COVID crisis. As I said before, Ron Wyden has introduced the Critical Medical Infrastructure Right to Repair Act of 2020. It is also very kind of striking in Edward Snowden's permanent record that, amongst other things, he has a discussion about the importance of the right to repair in a modern democracy and how important it was to be able to work out how technologies actually worked and to be able to take them apart and to make sure that they weren't spying on you or doing anything else. So hopefully I think we will have a revolution soon in terms of a greater recognition of the right to repair in Australia and internationally. Thank you very much.